Good afternoon. My name is Christine Anderson, and I am the Anti-Trafficking and Runaway Homeless Youth Program Coordinator here at OCFS in the Division of Youth Development and Partnership for Success. In that role, I serve as the Program Manager for the Safe Harbor New York program, and that's what brings me here with all of you today for the final day of our 6th annual Anti-Trafficking Summit. I'm so glad you're all here with us for our amazing keynote speech. A few little housekeeping items. If you have IT issues during the presentation, you can email info@welfareresearch.org and we will get you help. The other option you have is you can either raise your hand or type your issue in the chat and we will get help to you either way. All of our presentations are being recorded and will be posted in HSLC as well as our OCFS YouTube channel a few weeks after the event, so be on the lookout for that. Certificates of attendance are issued after summit. So if you need a certificate of attendance, you can email the human trafficking mailbox at OCFS, and I will put that email address in the chat box as well, requesting a certificate of attendance. We ask 2 things when you make that request. The first is that you list all of the sessions you attended. If you attended all of them, you can just say, I attended every session during Summit, as well as please be patient and give us a few weeks after Summit to get you those certificates. It is a bit of a process and we do take a lot of time to make sure that's done and it's done well. So be patient with us. We promise we will get them to you. Next week, you will also receive a post-Summit survey. Please, please, please take a few minutes and give us your feedback. We do look at it and use it to incorporate it into our future trainings and technical assistance offerings. Lastly, all participants are muted during the presentation. Our amazing presenter has about 45 minutes worth of content to share with you, and then we will have a question and answer period at the end. We ask that you put all your questions in the chat, which is located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see the little word bubble. And please make sure your chat is set to host and panelists so we can all see it so we don't miss your question. If for some reason we don't get to your question today or you think of something after the fact, we do have access to the chat at all times, and as well as after the fact, we get a printout of it, and so we can get you an answer as soon as we're done. With that said, I do want to take a minute to introduce our speaker today. Teresa Stafford serves as the Chief Program Officer at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, which is the largest independent rape crisis center in the country, whose mission is to support survivors of rape and sexual abuse, promote healing and prevention, and advocate for social change in our community. She has over 25 years of experience providing direct service to offenders and victims of crime with a specialization in sexual violence, domestic violence, and families of homicide victims. She provides expertise and consultation to communities, developing their sexual assault response teams, training to law enforcement agencies regarding the dynamics of sexual violence, human trafficking, intimate partner violence, and working with sexual assault providers. She specializes in working with faith-based communities, MDTs, and systems to enhance their ability to respond to all in a trauma-informed manner. On top of all of that, she is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Inspiring Change Consulting Firm, where she's dedicated to shifting thoughts through transformative conversations that inspire individuals and organizations to change. We are so thrilled she could be with us today. Teresa, you're up.
Thank you for that. And I am so happy to be here today with you all. I'm your final presenter for this great conference as we discuss establishing an equitable response to human trafficking and thinking about this through the lens of what does equity look like and what does that mean for all survivors through their healing process. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. 1 second. Great. And so when we're talking about establishing an equitable response to human trafficking, I really think we have to start with understanding the criminalization of Black survivors of human trafficking. So today's presentation is going to focus a lot on Black survivors, but I will tell you this is something through my experience in the work that I've seen with the majority of survivors of color, but definitely with young Black females that engage in the criminal justice system due to their trafficking experience. I first became aware and started working in the trafficking field probably about 2006 when I started working at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. Before then, I spent about 13 years working in corrections, where a lot of the young ladies who were in the correctional facility were there because of their drug addiction, and those ladies who often were trafficked during their drug addiction. Many times we didn't use that term trafficking back then in the early 90s. We were calling them prostitutes, just very negative terms associated with their experience. We wasn't using the term human trafficking. But really for me, the first person that I engaged with who was a survivor of human trafficking was my best friend in junior high school. And this was in the late 80s, the early 80s. And so this young lady, unfortunately, her parents were addicted to crack cocaine at the height of the crack epidemic. This young lady never made it to ninth grade. The summer between 8th grade and 9th grade, her father, who was sort of her mother's boyfriend, got her addicted to crack cocaine, her and her sister. And, we would see her out on the streets. She was working the streets, and she was working the streets for her drug addiction and to feed her family's drug addiction, to take care of the bills. We didn't call that human trafficking back then. That young lady was severely failed by the community because everybody saw what was going on. She was failed by the local police department, which was only about 2 minutes down the street. The neighborhood was patrolled heavily by police, but no one stopped and said, hey, what's going on with this child? Why is she not in school? Even our school system, I can remember going to high school and people asking, like, where is she? It's like, it seemed to be no care of what was going on with this young lady's life. The next time I saw her, again, it wasn't at high school graduation. It wasn't at a bridal shower. It wasn't during my wedding or her wedding, none of that stuff. The next time I saw her, I was like I said earlier, I worked in corrections, and I saw her inside of a cell when I was making rounds doing my head count. She was a shell of herself. I learned from her that she had been in and out of the criminal justice system basically since the 8th grade due to using drugs, running away from home, leaving home, having disruptions with her family, and now she was seen as a criminal. But no one connected back to the fact that she was being trafficked. She was being forced to sell her body by her parents who had control over her. And it just really highlighted for me about how often that survivors are failed. And haven't sat at the table and haven't had the opportunity to sit at the table in multidisciplinary teams or in case reviews at our safe harbor docket, I was continuously seeing these same systems in 2020 and 2000 play out the same way that a friend of mine was being subjected to being re-victimized and re-traumatized by the very system that's designed to help support survivors and protect them. And so today our conversation, we're going to talk about a trauma-informed approach and examining the elements of trauma-informed care and what it actually means to be trauma-informed. We're going to discuss the disparities within identifying and responding to survivors of color. And hopefully the folks on the line, you will develop skills to advocate effectively and equitably for survivors of color. And in doing so, we have to acknowledge the biases that we all carry and gain tools to mitigate those biases when engaging with survivors. The substance abuse and mental health system define what trauma-informed means in our community as providers. So a trauma-informed approach means that we acknowledge and understand the widespread impact of trauma, and we also understand that trauma is not going to present in this cookie-cutter approach. That trauma will present differently for individuals who have experienced trauma. There's no one way that trauma will look. We also understand there's various modalities and different methods to helping people heal from their trauma. And then those who are the professionals that engage with survivors are impacted by trauma as well. And that trauma-informed approach, goes from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. SANSA identifies 6 key principles to help establish a trauma-informed approach. And that's safety. How do we create safety for those survivors that we engage with? How does that safety look for them when they're coming into our facilities? How do we create trustworthiness and transparency? Are we being trustworthy when we say we're going to do something? Are we actually following through? One of the things I learned early when working with survivors of human trafficking, they're going to give you little, and this is really survivors of sexual violence as well, but definitely I saw this more so with survivors of human trafficking. They're going to give you little pieces of their experience. They're going to give you little nuggets to see if they can trust you. They're going to ask to see if you're going to follow up and do something. Because so often these survivors have been failed tremendously by professionals that they want to see if they can trust you first before they fully open up. And then, are you being transparent with them about your limitations? I know there, in my community, at least I could say this very strongly, in my community, there is no one agency that can effectively respond to human trafficking. Understand your limitations. And so with that, understand, hey, yes, you're at my agency today, but these are some things that I just identified, or you have identified you want to help with. I can't provide that for you, but I also have a great partner that we work with. Do you mind me calling them in? So that's being transparent about your limitations. And that's how that trust is built. And then peer support, connecting survivors to other survivors. That's so important. When I found out in human trafficking is that, survivors of human trafficking really want to be in spaces where other people who may have experienced a similar victimization with them. And then how does that look for a team responding to human trafficking? Is that peer support built within that team? And then collaboration and mutuality. We should be collaborating with our community partners and working together, and then also collaborating with that survivor. They are the best person to talk about their healing process and what they need to move through that healing process to remain safe. And are we giving survivors empowerment and a voice and a choice in a situation? And choice can be something so minor. I was working with a survivor and she needed a telephone. And what was choice for her? I had 5 different phones that I could offer her. None of them were fancy, but I offered her like, hey, which one of these phones do you want to use? Which one of these phones would best suit your needs? And so she looked at me, she was like, they're just a phone. I was like, yeah, it's just a phone, but I want you to choose which one is best for you, which one you want. Because we know when individuals have experienced human trafficking, oftentimes they have very limited ability to make choices through their trafficking situation. And then another part of the last one is cultural and historical and gender issues. This is really where organizations, where I often see it, a lot of them get 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. They can talk about how they're providing safety, how they're providing trustworthiness, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, voice, and choice. But when it gets to the cultural, historical, and gender issues, majority of organizations can't really articulate how they're approaching cultural, historical trauma and how they're connecting these cultural historical trauma into their service plans and how they deliver their work. And so when we're thinking about cultural and historical trauma and gender issues, this is really basically understanding the nuances that some survivors have to face due to their cultural identities that they carry, and understanding how that generational and historical trauma impacts them today. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into cultural historical trauma in just a couple of slides. So one of my first polling questions to you all, does your agency, your child advocacy center, your multidisciplinary team incorporate all 6 key principles of trauma-informed approach when responding to sex trafficking? If the polling question can come up. Is the polling question up? I can't see it.
Yes, we're getting responses.
Okay, great. I can't see it on my end.
Yep. We will share shortly.
And while you all are answering this question, I was at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center probably about 4 years ago. I challenged my own organization with this question. I said, I'm not sure if we're fully trauma informed, and my supervisor, she was she was one of the individuals that initiated our trauma-informed practices throughout our organization. And I was like, hey, well, we'll look at these 6 key principles. I don't know if we're really truly incorporating all of these 6 key principles into the work that we're doing day to day. And so, I got a little pushback. And then I said, hey, the reason why I'm saying this, when I look at the data, I noticed that survivors of color don't stay engaged in our services at the same rate of other survivors. And I was told, well, the trauma is just too much. Maybe they're just not ready to deal with all of the trauma. And I was like, well, I'm sorry, that sounds a little bit victim blaming to me. And I started diving deeper into the data and we did surveys. We engaged with the Begun Center, it's a research center at Case Western Reserve. And through that work with the Begun Center, we learned that survivors of color felt that their cultural identity, whether it's their race, their sexual orientation, or their social economic status, was not always seen or respected when they engaged with us, which then led to a higher percentage of these survivors disengaging in our services. And so for me, that made me think like, hey, what are we doing when we're engaging? Are we understanding historical and cultural trauma? Are we understanding race relations? Are we understanding that, our criminal justice system, our social service system, our healthcare systems sometimes have practices within them that are not equitable? And are we mirroring some of them same practices within our own organization? And so from that, we started really diving and doing deeper work around cultural and historical trauma to ensuring that we're not approaching survivors with this cookie cutter approach, this one size fits all, and really tailoring our services to people individually and not just collectively.
Great. Teresa, can you see the poll results?
I cannot see the poll results on my end.
I will share them with you. You have 38% yes, 6% no, and 55% I don't know.
Okay, great. Thank you. So folks, I challenge you, hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will be thinking about how you can go back to your organization and identify if your organization is actually incorporating all 6 of these principles. And if you are not incorporating all 6 of these principles, develop a work plan so you can start incorporating them, look at your data, dive deeper into it. And then I know at the end of this presentation, we'll have a Q&A where we can really talk a little bit more about what does that look like for your organization. So when we think about sex trafficking, I have to think about it through the lens of sex trafficking and looking at systemic racism. Systemic racism is the continued practices of establishing inequitable policies that further disenfranchise or causes harm to people of color. When you think about sex trafficking and the intersection between systemic racism and sex trafficking, you will see that connection where systemic racism within our institutions and in society impacts the increase of people of color, specifically Black girls being trafficked. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionalities, which sought to explain the oppression of African-American women in the United States. She further took this to include girls of color who are at the intersection of exploitation. They are sexualized because of their gender, and then they're often criminalized because of their race. For girls of color and Black women, their victimization and the response from the system of their victimization is also systematic. And this is why we have to look inward and outward and understanding how historical trauma is present day reality. And so what I mean by that is that when we think about what race in the United States and the enslavement of Black bodies, it was a loss of cultural identity, separation of families. And when we think about young Black girls or girls of color who are trafficked, majority of them are separated from their family in the foster care system. And they make up the highest percentage of youth in the foster care system. There is also rapid sexual assault of both Black men and women during the enslavement of Black bodies. And there were reproduction plantations where Black female bodies were seen as capital. Race in America has historically defined what rape is. And what I mean by that is punishment existed solely for the victimization of white women. There was a case, however, in 1859, the George versus the state, where a Black slave was charged with sexually assaulting another Black young slave. He was actually found guilty, which is unheard of during that time period. His attorney appealed the sentencing, arguing to the court that they had no control over their sexual being because they were slaves, and that sex between a Black slave to Black female slave and a Black male slave was really just promiscuous behavior. And if you want to say it wasn't rape, it was considered a mere assault and battery. And a lot of times when I stood in court advocating for survivors of sexual violence, and especially for Black survivors, and if their perpetrator was Black, majority of the time their cases was pled down. Now, yes, majority of all cases within the criminal justice system were pled down, but what I noticed with these survivors that I was working with, majority of the time their cases were pled down to non-sex offense cases. They were pled down to mere assaults, and typically the assault that's like the bar fight assault, that's basically saying the victim provoked their own victimization. And so when you see this case with George versus the state, which is 1859, and this is happening in present day reality, we can see how that historical trauma actually plays into part to how society and systems respond to the victimization of women of color. And during this time period, Black women didn't have ownership of their bodies. Again, they were seen as capital. And this is going to play out in some research that I'm going to share with you shortly. Now, in my society, I got this screen. If you look at the screen, you'll see just images, a Google image, a screenshot from Google. I Google human trafficking. And when I Google human trafficking, I have to go 4 to 5 pages deep before I see a young Black person, a young Black girl, or even a woman of color who is trafficked. And so when you're constantly seeing these images of human trafficking, and we know that 40% of those identified as trafficking from the FBI were identified as Black girls and Black women. But when you go on and do a Google search, you barely see any images in our society with regards to Black survivors of sex trafficking. And so that goes back to that historical trauma that I talked about, where race has historically defined what rape is in America. And it's still sort of defining who we have determined are sex trafficking survivors in our society. When you look at images in your community, it's very limited images of young Black girls on those images, of the marketing material, of the posters that are talking about human trafficking. So when we constantly are digesting information that don't show that young Black girls are survivors of human trafficking, it's really hard for people to connect that when they are victimized, that they're victims. They're often blamed. And because that leads to barriers to disclosure when they're in identification. There is an increased self-blame and internalized oppression that can take place. For all survivors, there's a fear of not being believed, but that fear increases for some survivors due to their racial identity. And then we talk about the intersection of race and gender, especially when we have at the forefront for the last couple of years, we're seeing the injustices and the disparities within our criminal justice system. There is a connection sometimes for survivors of color not to disclose who their trafficker is, not to disclose who's causing them harm due to the interracial dynamics that exist for them. The stigmatization of African American and Black female sexuality, when Black women express their sexual being, is seen as a negative. However, when others express their sexuality, it's seen as a positive, that they're empowering themselves. There's a need for training across all of our systems to understand the historical trauma that exists, and also to understand, how do we control our biases when we're engaging with those that look different from us, but that may present different. And then the adultification of girls of color. I'm going to talk about that research in a little bit. And then the lack of diversity in our programs and systems. I was at the Rape Crisis Center. I've been there since 2006. And when I first started, I was the only person of color on staff for many years. When I got to a position where I was able to start hiring, that diversity increased on my team, not across the organization, but on my team. I did leave the agency for about 4 years to go to our county prosecutor's office and establish their witness victim unit. What I noticed those 4 years where I were gone, it was an exodus of the people of color within the organization. And I came back again as the only person of color. And I'm in a major urban community. I am in Cleveland, and our Cleveland Rape Crisis Center was sitting right downtown in the middle of the community. And so for me, it highlighted that there was a lack of understanding around the high rates of victimization for people of color, specifically for Black women. And also it highlighted for me that, organizations need to do internal work so we are able to better externally help survivors of sexual violence. And you think about within our criminal justice system and other systems, majority of the time, law enforcement, prosecutors, and the judge are from the dominant culture. Oh, my screen stopped sharing. Oh. Are from the dominant culture. And when you have that dynamic in place and you are a survivor of color and maybe somebody has, caused harm to you or discriminated against you, it makes it a little bit more challenging for you to engage with those professionals. And so what I often talk about doing the work at the individual, the interpersonal, and the institutional level. So those of us who work in the systems and work for these organizations must understand who we are and how we present and engage with people at an interpersonal level before we go into our institutions and try to make policy changes. And even as a person of color, as a Black female, I had to do my own work and make sure I wasn't creating policies through dirty lenses or projecting internalized oppression when I was making policies as a manager and leader. And then a lack of cultural humility, really understanding, when I first started doing this work, we talked about being culturally competent. And it's really hard to be competent of a culture that you are not from, or even within a culture you're from, because there are subcultures within cultures. And so really we are positioning ourselves to be more culturally humble, to where we understand and can have respect for other cultures, regardless of how they may present. And then I already talked about the systemic racism that is present, that is a barrier for disclosure and identification for survivors of sex trafficking. Which takes us into the stereotyping of Black survivors. Black survivors are often stereotyped, and these stereotypes are directly related from enslavement of Black bodies, where Black females were seen as very hypersexual. They were called Jezebel, Sapphire, then you had the Mamie, and then those are terms that were utilized like really during slavery that crossed over into the Jim Crow era. And then we started using more common day terms as fast. Fast girls. When I was growing up, they used the term all the time. If you wear red fingernail polish or red lipstick, or if you were out there playing with the boys, you were fast. It was all of these terms that if you did this, if you didn't present in a certain manner, there was very negative terms associated with you. And so for survivors, when they're digesting this information at a high rate from media, from within their family structures, and from within institutions, when they project this outwardly, for that survivor, disclosing is going to be a challenge. The fear of not being believed is going to be a challenge for that survivor. And then as young Black girls and women are seen as Jezebels, they're seen as sex objects, they're seen as individuals who can be victimized because of these negative stereotypes. And when we continuously think about these stereotypes that we see in the media, that we see out here in society, these stereotypes causes extreme harm in responding to sex trafficking. And the reason why I say that is because it shifts the blame from the institutions and the perpetrators that are causing harm to the survivor. It is victim blaming at its highest level. Great example of this is the Surviving R. Kelly docuseries that was established, came out a couple years ago. In that series, R. Kelly, he was accused and recently found guilty of sex trafficking and other sex crimes, but it was multiple ladies that came forward and said that he victimized them, that he caused them harm, that he sexually assaulted them. After that docuseries, on social media, you were just reading through the comment sections, that people were calling these young ladies very derogatory terms, blaming them for their victimization, saying they knew what they were getting into, calling them just every negative thing you can think of. But what happened when people did that, they shut those survivors down and was not focusing on what happened to them. They were solely looking at these young ladies as, they set this up, they knew what was going on, and it shifted the blame from the institution, law enforcement, when individuals have reported numerous times that he caused them harm. It shifted the blame from the perpetrator. Because of that, this individual was able to, for decades, cause harm to young Black girls and women because of these negative stereotypes that's associated with them. And as long as we do that in our society, we allow for perpetrators to continuously cause harm to a population of individuals because we don't feel they're as worthy as others, because of these stereotypes that have been subjected upon them historically. Again, when I talk about that historical trauma, it is present day reality. And until we can really truly make that connection, it might be hard for some of us and some of our institutions to take that shift away from blaming survivors for their own victimization. I have sat in these MDT meetings with our Safe Harbor docket, and for folks on the line, Safe Harbor in Ohio and across other states, Safe Harbor is basically a law that was established where for survivors of sex trafficking who engage in the criminal justice system, can possibly have their cases held at abeyance if they're able to say that the charges that they're presenting for are directly connected to their sex trafficking experience. So we go into the criminal justice system over our juvenile court, we do human trafficking victim assessments, help identify these young folks and help get them connected to the Safe Harbor docket so services can get wrapped around them, and hopefully they can walk away with a whole case plan, people in the community supporting them, and no criminal charges. I have literally sat in case plan meetings where we're talking about cases and we'll have a Black young female, and the way the professionals in the meeting talk about this young female compared to the way they talk about the next young female who is a Caucasian young female, a white female, is totally different. One is very victim blaming. One is saying she has very manipulative behaviors. They say the other one, oh, that's just her trauma response. And really they're describing the same thing, but the word choice is different. And so when we see these young ladies as manipulative, when we see them as fast, when we see them as, just not wanting to follow the rules of home, instead of saying, hey, this young lady has experienced trauma. This is her trauma response. When we use these one set of language versus another set, we're projecting those stereotypes. We're projecting our biases into the decision-making process. And I have watched it over and over and over again happen. And once we started having these really heart-to-heart conversations at our board meetings, was when we were able to really change how we were responding to all survivors and create a more equitable response. But those conversations, folks, I will tell you, was not easy. And it was very challenging conversations. It was hard for some people to hear what they were saying, because at the heart of it, I truly believe most people are in this work for the right reason, to do the right thing, but unconsciously, because we have started digesting all these stereotypes that society have projected upon young Black girls and women, that we are projecting them out in how we engage with survivors, the decisions that we make. And so again, it shifts that blame from our institutions and the perpetrators into really blaming the victims for how they're showing up. There was a study completed by the Georgetown Law University. And in the study, they basically analyzed, there's about 300 some adults that participated in the study. And these adults were from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds. And they were asked questions. And out of the survey, what they identified that the population that was surveyed roughly believed that Black girls from the ages of 5 to 14 years old seemed older than their white counterparts, needed less nurturing, less protection, less support, less comfort. They were more independent, knew more about adult topics, and knew more about sex than white girls. And so when you think about that dynamic, when you having social services respond, when you're having law enforcement respond, and this is a collective group. This wasn't one racial group that stated this. This was a very mixed racial group that thought this, between the ages of girls of 5 to 14 years old. When we know that the average age for trafficking is the entry into trafficking is about 12 years old. And 99% of the young girls that we have worked with at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center experienced a form of sexual abuse before they were trafficked. Majority of those young girls' cases were unsubstantiated, they weren't believed, and they were often sent back home to where their perpetrators had access to them. And so when these young girls are being identified as possibly trafficked victims, trafficked survivors, what does this say when the data is saying that in our society, we don't see these young girls as girls? We see them as adults, very mature, need less protection. They're more independent. They know more about sex. So how do we respond to their victimization? And I'll tell you, respond to their victimization the same way that, we see over and over again that how society responds to Black girls. When a Black girl goes missing, we don't see the news that we just seen recently on the young white lady that was found murdered and she was missing. We don't see a collective response from society when Black girls go missing. We don't see that. Even for our Native American Indigenous women, the high rate of the high number of those individuals that are missing in our society, you don't see a national response. And so what I noticed is that because of data like this, it really just highlighted to me what I was seeing already, that in society, we are not responding equitably to the victimization of girls of color in our society. We're victim blaming, and we are not holding offenders accountable. And when offenders are not held accountable, we know that they're gonna cause harm to other survivors, to other young ladies. And the reality of it is, traffickers know this. Traffickers know. In a report with the Urban Institute and the Rights for Girls, that they interviewed traffickers, and the traffickers admitted that they will make more money off of trafficking a white woman. However, they would get less time in jail for trafficking a Black girl. And so when our perpetrators know this, that's why we see an increased victimization for Black girls and girls of color with regards to sex trafficking. Sam Little was a prolific serial rapist and serial killer who was in prison and has identified that he has murdered over 90 women across the country. Majority of these women that he murdered and sexually assaulted were women of color, Black women and Hispanic women, and women from other marginal identities that are marginalized in our society, such as maybe they were using drugs, maybe they had a criminal background, or he deemed them to be sex workers. In his interview that I had an opportunity to watch clips of, Sam Little stated, he stayed in the ghettos. He didn't murder any fancy people. And in his mind, he was causing harm to what we call the less of these, those individuals he knew that nobody cared about in society. He also said in that interview, had he had killed blonde-haired, blue-eyed white girls, he would have been caught a long time ago. So in the Urban Institute report, they identified the traffickers admittedly saying that they would traffic Black girls because they know they're not going to get enough time. They're not going to get time in prison. And you have a serial killer that's basically saying the same thing. We as professionals can change that. We can change that dynamic by changing how we respond. It requires that multidisciplinary response. It requires a team of individuals from various backgrounds. And so we also have to do that internal work, as I talked earlier, so we can understand why we are showing up the way we are and looking at the policies and practices within all of our institutions and changing them. Until we do that level of work and really hold each other accountable at the table, we're going to continuously see those most marginalized in our society being victimized the most. And so I want to switch over to talking about some of the vulnerabilities that exist within communities of color for Black girls that increases the chances of them being victimized and trafficked more. So I talked about that history of sexual abuse or physical abuse. Studies show that over 60% of young Black girls will experience some form of victimization before the age of 18. For every one Black female that is reported, at least 15 don't. Unfortunately, we know there's some community instability, that community trauma that exists that can increase victimization. The high percentage of Black girls that are involved in the child welfare system and placed into foster care, being considered a runaway or homeless youth. And I would say the term runaway is something that when we are talking about children who are trafficked, we really need to get away from using that term runaway because it changes the response in society. So when we say that a youth is missing, it projects a different emotion for people. Like, hey, we have a missing youth, we have to come together. When we say that a person has ran away, it typically evokes a response that that child has some responsibility for being missing because they left on their own accord. But when you really understand the dynamics of trafficking, you will understand that, you know, these young folks leave home because they have to. Not always because they want to, because they have to. And so what I mean by that, I was working a case years ago, and this young lady, she was leaving home often. She was being trafficked. And, you know, most people think that trafficked individuals are gone, they never go back home, but that's not the reality, really. A lot of our young folks that we engage with, they go in and out of home, in and out of home. And so this one young lady, she was at home for about 6 months, and for her to be at home without leaving for that long period of time was considered a success. She left one day, and the day that she left, her mother was at home, and her mother's lights were turned off. And so mom called the utility company. It's like, hey, my lights are off. What's going on? The utility company said, hey, your lights should be on. We'll send a bus out, a truck out. Your bill is paid. We don't know what's going on. Come to find out that somebody cut the electricity to the house. That young lady saw that as a sign that her trafficker was telling her to come back home to him. And he also threatened her if she stay away too long, that he was going to cause harm to her little brother. Her little brother walked to school, and she really, really cared about her little brother. So she left home to protect home. And so when mom went to the 5th District Police Station in Cleveland, when mom went to the district to make a police report, they said, oh, she always goes missing. She'll come back. You know, that's what she does. Again, we've been working with this young lady for about 2 years, and she will leave, she'll come back. She will leave and she'll come back. And mom was like, no, something's different this time. This is, you know, I do believe that she's in harm. They wrote it off. This young lady was identified and found later. And kind of find out, she disclosed to us why she left home that time. She wasn't running away from home. She was leaving home because home, she was trying to protect home. And then sometimes we hear these young ladies, earlier you heard me talk about the high number of young ladies who are on the docket, who had a previous sexual assault in their background, and most of their cases was unsubstantiated, and they were sent back home. Had a couple young ladies, they're doing their assessments, would say they were leaving home because home wasn't safe, that they felt they had more control in their trafficking situations than in the victimization they were experiencing within their household. And so I just push us to look at that word differently and use the word missing instead of runaway. Because runaway is a victim blaming term that we often see evokes a different response. And then we see a lot of the girls are disconnected from the educational system. Monique Morris did a book, Push Out, and that book highlighted how young Black girls are pushed out of school and into the criminal justice system at an extremely high rate. And when we know that these young ladies are disconnected from the educational system, their likelihood to be trafficked increases tremendously. And then there's that social economic status part of it, poverty. We have to address poverty in our society to really get to the root of human trafficking and sex trafficking as well. Black girls are more likely to be trafficked at a younger age. I talked about that, experiencing sex abuse. Some statistics from the FBI says that 50% of all juvenile prostitution arrests are Black children. We should not be arresting children in our society for prostitution because children cannot legally be prostitutes. Somebody is controlling them 9 times out of 10. There is a factor in it that we have to really look at. If we arrest and charge them with prostitution, we are again blaming them for their own victimization. False promises of wealth with the social economic status part. Traffickers will use that. If we know that Black girls are more likely to experience poverty compared to their racial counterparts, the traffickers use that to promise them things that they don't typically have access to. And once they do that, they create this sense of belonging. They create this sense of entitlement, and they create a sense of now you owe me. And because of that, we see that these young girls are brought into trafficking at a higher rate. We worked some cases with these young girls who are really in our community, like making their trafficking experiences seem glamorized. And they were doing that because they're connected with the trafficker. They had that trauma binding going on at a really high rate. And so because they lived in extreme poverty, these young ladies thought that the life that they were living was glamorous, and Unfortunately, one of them started recruiting other girls into the lifestyle. And because of that, that changed her position with the trafficker, where she didn't have to work as hard, where she wasn't harmed as much. And so those promises of false wealth and their indebtedness to the trafficker increases the likelihood for these young ladies to be trafficked. Kind of talked about this, to push out the criminalization of Black girls in schools. And I will tell you, as a person, I am a survivor of child abuse, child sex abuse at a very young age, from about 8 to 14 years old. I was pushed out of school and into the criminal justice system. I attended over probably 8 different schools and never moved. I lived in the same address, but I was pushed out of multiple schools. I was suspended over 20 times. I spent time in the juvenile criminal justice system because of my trauma response. And no one ever asked me when I was engaging in the criminal justice system, or when I was getting in trouble, no one ever asked me what was going on. Everybody just deemed me a very unruly child, a delinquent child is the juvenile justice system, but nobody connected my trauma to why I was engaging in the manner I was engaging in. And we see a high number of young ladies who are pushed out into the criminal justice system because of their sex abuse experience. And unfortunately, a lot of these young girls go on to be sex trafficked. Our criminal justice system, we have, like I talked about, the safe harbor docket. It was designed to establish to help identify young folks in the criminal justice system and wrap them with services to support them. However, what we are seeing is an increased number of cases where young Black girls are typically charged with very, very violent crimes and pushed into an adult system because of their victimization. We heard the case of Crystal Kaiser out from Wisconsin. She was charged with killing her trafficker. This young lady was charged as an adult with killing her trafficker, somebody who had been trafficking her and sexually assaulting her over a period of time. That was the only way she felt she can leave her trafficking situation. She's out now awaiting trial. And then we hear the case, we know about the case of Satoya Brown, who was also charged in her trafficking situation. In Ohio, we have the case of Alexis Martin, where she was charged with a murder that was connected to her trafficking. These young ladies all had engaged with the criminal justice system, engaged with child protective services before it got to that level. And we really have to figure out a way to provide better services and identify these individuals as traffic survivors and not criminalize them. One of the things, even through our safe harbor dockets, although we have these dockets established in certain communities, I have still seen practices that mimic us penalizing these young ladies. For instance, we had a young lady on the docket. The previous judge that was connected to this docket gave an order that she couldn't have a cell phone. And she couldn't have a cell phone because, her trafficker connected her through a cell phone. She will post pictures or be forced to post pictures on different social media sites to sell her body. So the judge said, hey, while you're on probation right now, until we can get you to a stabilized situation, you cannot have access to a cell phone. She came into court for a status hearing. She had a cell phone. The judge said, hey, either you give me your cell phone or I'm gonna lock you up in the juvenile detention center. She's a 15-year-old girl with an attitude. She said, here, take it, and had an attitude. Unfortunately, the judge didn't like her response and still locked her up. And I really had to have a conversation with the judge, like, you didn't build transparency right there. You didn't build any trust. You told her one thing that she couldn't have it, but gave her a chance to give it to you, and you still locked her up. She said, well, I didn't like her attitude. Well, you have made it so much harder for her to trust me and for her to trust this process because you still locked her up anyway. And so we see how even when they're on these specialized dockets, that people are penalized, and these young girls are penalized for their behaviors. And we have to remember their trauma brain and their brain is still underdeveloped, and they're going to respond in manners that we as adults might not feel is appropriate, but we have to look over that and understand what is going on with these individuals. And so I constantly see, even in these specialized dockets, we see the individuals are being treated like criminals instead of the victims that they are. And so we have this juvenile docket, and over in our municipal court, we have another docket to identify trafficked individuals at the muni level who are adults who are trafficked, to wrap them with services as well. One of the things I noticed is that our juvenile docket is filled with young African-American girls. They're identified because they're entering the juvenile justice system at a higher rate compared to their counterparts. On the adult side of it, I noticed that the majority of young ladies who have access to that specialized docket are white females. And so I started asking the questions like, where are these girls? They're turning 18, they're still engaging with the system. Why don't they have access to this specialized docket? And so one of the things I was told was, well, they don't have access to the docket. They're actually going through and getting charged instead of actually having services wrapped around them. And so we can see again where there's disparities within the criminal justice system about who gets help and who is seen and identified as a survivor. It also started making me think, what's going on? We're not identifying young white females who might be in traffic too, because they don't go through the criminal justice system, because they're not pushed into the criminal justice system. So it seems like it's a double-edged sword that when we create practices that are inequitable, we're causing harm to survivors on both ends of the spectrum. We can identify some and we're not identifying others. If we're only identifying young Black girls through the criminal justice system, imagine those survivors of sex trafficking who are juveniles that haven't engaged with the criminal justice system that we're not identifying and that's not receiving the support that they need. The sex abuse to prison pipeline, a girl story. I kind of hit this a little bit earlier. The number of young ladies who are in the juvenile justice system that are girls of color is growing tremendously. It's one of the fastest growing populations that we have within the criminal justice system. Some states approximately show that 22% of the general population are girls of color that are, 22% of the general population are girls of color, although they make up about 66% of those who are incarcerated. And so when you look at a number that high, you can see the disparities that are taking place, and the number of girls within that fraction that has experienced sexual violence or sex trafficking increases tremendously. And so we're asking a system that's not trauma-informed to help survivors of sexual abuse and sex trafficking. We have to find another way to provide support outside of the criminal justice system. Because a lot of times, once these girls are in the criminal justice system, they don't trust anyone. And I work at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. Although we're not part of the system, they see us as part of the system. They don't separate that out. And so it makes our work a little bit more challenging to overcome the lack of trust that they have. If I'm a survivor and you know that I'm a survivor of sex trafficking and I'm a survivor of sexual abuse, and the way you want to deal with my trauma response is by locking me up, then why would I trust you with anything else? And so what we also know, when these young ladies enter these systems, whether it's the foster care system, the criminal justice system, sexual victimization is taking place again. And so we're removing them, and I hear the words that, we put them in these systems to protect them, but they're being harmed within these systems. And so if you haven't read The Sex Abuse to Prison Pipeline, the girl story, I challenge you to read it, dive into it. It's a quick read. It's something that I have all of my new staff read, especially so they can understand, our role as advocates to really advocate at a high level for these survivors to ensure that these systems don't cause them more harm, especially when they're pushed into the criminal justice system as a survivor of sex trafficking or sexual abuse. They're often called difficult. I was doing a training in our juvenile justice system with some new prosecutors, new probation officers, our guardian ad lites, and the judge who introduced me, she said, hey, these girls, you're not gonna like them. They're gonna be difficult. They're gonna cuss you out. They're gonna have an attitude. It was all of these negative words associated with who these girls were, and not one comment about the trauma that they have experienced, and that the way that they're presenting is a direct connection to the trauma. And so as I was standing there listening to this judge do my introduction to do human trafficking training, I had to stop it before I could even get into his training and explain to them that, hey, I was that difficult girl. I stood in this courthouse as a juvenile delinquent. I was difficult. I was called all these things. I was manipulative. I was unruly. I was called all these things, and the look on their faces was in disbelief. And I said, no, I was in here. I was called all of those things. It was my trauma. How do we say this person is traumatized? How do we say this is their coping mechanism for everything that this individual experienced? When we shift the way we talk about people, we respond to them differently. But if we're responding and calling them these negative words that are associated with their trauma, then people are going to respond to them differently, especially young, impressionable, new professions who have never engaged with people outside of their cultures, or who have never really worked in this field. It's a scapegoat. So we have to change our language. And our language is so important, because if we're calling them difficult, if we're calling them unruly, and saying all these negative words that's associated with them, how do you show up as a professional when you engage with that individual? Are you showing up in a manner that's trauma-informed? Are you showing up in a manner that you're open to listening to this individual's experience? Or are you taking these negative words that's already been associated with them and thinking that you can't help them? And so I had a probation officer who I really like how he shifted in doing his work. He shifted from where he stopped reading all of the reports from his individuals that was on probation assigned to him. He stopped reading reports first before meeting with the youth. When he said, when he would read the reports, he heard all this stuff, he would read all these negative things associated with this youth, and it changed how he approached the youth, because he had this image of this youth in his head already. And what he shifted to was meeting the youth first, getting to know them as an individual, and then reading a report. He said that approach changed how he engaged, because he wasn't reading all of these negative things associated with them. He was getting to know that person as an individual first. And so when we do that shift, it allows us to be more open, and it allows us to probably check our biases a little bit easier and develop these one-on-one relationships. And so just some other areas I want to hit before we go into how can we really create a more equitable response is understanding like sex trafficking and gangs. A lot of the young Black girls in my system here in Cleveland who are connected to sex trafficking are also affiliated with gangs. They joined the gang for various reasons, that emotional connection, maybe having low self-esteem, really needed to have a sense of belonging to something due to not feeling that they have a connection at home or a connection at school. They also may be living in very dangerous neighborhoods, and joining a gang was out of protection. And little did they know that joining a gang, their contribution to the gang would be their body. And so we have the gang, the Heartless Felons, which is one of the biggest gangs. It was established here in Cleveland and has grown across the state of Ohio. It was started in detention facilities, and now it's also in our state adult prisons. This gang is trafficking young girls at an extremely high rate. And one of the things I would tell you, when I noticed this and started talking to these young girls, I mean, they're, you're talking about that slide when I showed earlier with regards to why they don't disclose, it increases tremendously for them. They have watched these guys sometimes murder people, beat people, just cause severe harm. And so they feel as though if they even give a little bit of information, that their life is in danger. Their family member's life is in danger. And so it makes it working with these cases when gang involvement is involved in sex trafficking a little more challenging and difficult. And the young ladies might be a little bit more standoffish, but I'll tell you, be patient, understand the dynamics of gangs and what it means to be safe. I know I was working with one of my team members was working with a young lady, and she was involved with the Heartless Felons. When we first started working with her, she wasn't branded, but in the middle of working with her, they put a big old ugly tattoo of a broken heart on her neck. And that's how they branded her. One of the professionals that was working the case said, hey, your trafficker's in jail. You should be able to work with us now. He's in jail, you're safe. And what they didn't understand was like, yes, he's in jail, but the other gang members are not in jail. And even though he's in jail, he still has power in the streets. And so to just say, hey, you're safe now, and not understanding the dynamics of a gang was really letting her know that I can't trust you because you don't understand what I'm going through. You don't understand the danger that I'm in right now. and minimizing that put her in a place where she just shut down and disconnected completely. And so I want you all to look at that a little bit differently and think about, the young folks that you have worked with, if they were in a gang and they were sex trafficked, what were the barriers for you? How did you respond to that individual? And we see that a lot of these young ladies are using drugs, and they're using hardcore drugs, especially when they're connected to the gangs. And so just some of those challenges are things that that individual is doing to protect themselves. It's not trying to be just difficult in engaging with you and not really wanting help, but they're working in a manner of self-preservation. Kind of talked about the child protective services and the foster care system. This is one I see a high percentage of our young ladies are aging out of foster care. And once they age out of foster care, they're left to their own accord. And they're oftentimes may even start doing what's, I hate the term, but we use it professionally, survival sex. And it's where they set up to try to figure out how they're going to have clothing, how they're going to have shelter, how they're going to have food. And a trafficker comes in and take advantage of them. We also see a high percentage of the boys that are trafficked are connected to child protective services or the foster care system as well. And we need to really think about, how are we setting up these young folks to limit the vulnerabilities that traffickers will access them because of the foster care system. They become homeless. And especially right now, thinking about the pandemic that we're in the midst of still, that most of our shelters are packed. There's waiting lists to get into shelters. And so if you have someone aging out of foster care and maybe they don't have that supportive family structure from foster care, they're being homeless immediately. And so that increases their vulnerabilities. And as those of us working within the systems that help them, we have to start working on plans, not when they turn 18, but before they're 18 for stable housing. So I'm going to ask the second question. If you all can help me. Kristen, reminder, I cannot see the polling. Thank you. Have you seen some of these factors that I've just discussed impact how Black sex trafficking survivors are treated by the system and service providers? And I'm being real important when I say the system and service providers, because sometimes our non-government agencies feel as though they're not part of the problem, that they got it right, they're trauma-informed, and that they're responding to all survivors in a trauma-informed manner. But again, I gave you examples of my own experience at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center where we had to do some internal reflection and change how we were responding to survivors. So give you a couple more seconds.
Yeah, your poll is up.
And Krista, if you could just let me know the results, that would be great.
Sure. As soon as they pop up, I will share them with the group.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, we have 56% yes, 21% no, and 23% I don't know.
Yeah, so I said 50%, 56%, that's a high percentage that said yes. One of the things I would say is that we can change that narrative. But it has to be a collective approach to changing the narrative to where we support all survivors, we get to accountability for offenders and have safer communities. We have to recognize there is a problem. And when there is a problem, there's a solution, folks. So oftentimes we talk about the problem, but we don't get to a solution. So let's talk about the problem. One of the problems is really understanding your biases that you carry. And when we understand that we all have biases, especially our unconscious biases, and it impacts the decision-making process, we can get to a place where we can create more equitable systems within our organizations and systemically as a whole. We all have biases. We all have unconscious biases. Our brain operates roughly about 95% on the unconscious level and 5% at the conscious level. And so when you have these biases, It's not a thing like something is like really wrong with you. It just means you're paying attention to the society and to society, right? Into which you are socialized into. So if you're seeing all these negative stereotypes that's associated with, you know, women of color, then you're going to start digesting that and believing it and project it out unconsciously. And because of that, oftentimes you don't even know you're doing it because it's very automatic, it's rapid. You don't even think about it. It's unconscious. And when we tend to point out like, hey, nobody's gonna say, hey, Teresa, you got a bias. They're gonna say, hey, Teresa, I know you handled this situation like this. I'm not sure if that was right because it caused harm over here to this survivor that you was engaging with. When we get something like that pointed out to us, we typically go into the defense because our biases run counter to who we are. I'm going to give you a quick example, just looking at the time. I'm going to give you a quick example of my own self. Early in my career, when I was working at a prosecutor's office, my supervisor, you know, told me I was working with all types of crimes across the spectrum, all survivors of various crimes. And I worked DV cases at that point in time. And I talked a lot of basketball with my supervisor. He was like, Teresa, you go hard in the paint for those survivors of sexual assault, but I don't see you necessarily going too hard for survivors of domestic violence. And, you know, I was offended by what he was saying because, you know, I'm a victim advocate. I am going to go hard for all survivors. That's what I signed up to do. This is the career I chose for myself, and I want to continuously grow in this career. Heck, y'all asked me to come over to this office and open up and create the witness victim unit. And so, you know, I had just attended this leadership training. They're talking about a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. So, you know, I had to take in that information and do some reflection. A lot of times our biases, they're connected to what we're digesting in society and, like I said earlier, how we're socialized. And so I had to go back to my own roots and understand why I was presenting in that manner with survivors of domestic violence. And one of the things I quickly realized is that, you know, as a child growing up, although like I said earlier, I experienced child sex abuse for many years, but growing up in my household, I also was told, and the ladies in my family always had this thing, if a man hits you once, he's going to hit you twice. Leave, you never stay. And so that was something that was just like in the fiber of who I am as a woman, right? I had a child at 16 years old, and, you know, I left home at about 18, living with my daughter's father, and he hit me. As soon as that happened, I called my brothers, I moved, I never turned back to that relationship. So in my mind, and I was unconsciously projecting this to those survivors that I was engaging with. Like, hey, I was 18 and making like $7 an hour. Here you are, 30, 40 years old, and you're making all this money. You can leave the relationship. Why are you unconsciously? I wasn't saying this out loud, but unconsciously I was projecting that. So I was advocating for them, but I might not have been advocating for them in the best manner. I might not have been putting on that full court press and doing all that I could for them. And so with that, I quickly understood that I needed to educate myself more. I was projecting how I responded to a situation onto these survivors. And a lot of times that's what we do. When people don't respond to a situation in a manner in which we will, our biases kick in at a higher rate. And so education is key, accountability partner is key, and doing self-reflection when somebody points out that you might be causing harm to somebody, getting to the root of why. Getting to the root of why you're showing up in that manner. It didn't make me a bad person. It just made me someone that needed to do some education. Because for survivors of domestic violence, the most dangerous time for them is that time when they decide to leave. And so if I would have never took those gold nuggets from my supervisor, I promise you, I know I wouldn't be where I am today professionally. And as a victim advocate, I didn't sign up to cause more harm to survivors. As law enforcement, as prosecutors, as judges, as child protective service workers, none of you all signed up to cause harm. But unconsciously, we can. And so when somebody's just pointed out, it's on us to really kind of unpack it and to ensure that we don't show up in that manner again. So our biases show up through microaggressions and macroaggressions. Macroaggressions are policies or practices within institutions that cause harm to people directly due to their identities that they carry. It can be their socioeconomic status, their sexual orientation, their race or ethnicity. And so an example of a macroaggression is our organization a couple years ago received some funding to incorporate transportation for our clients who needed transportation and services. services. One of our access to care team managers wanted to have folks, in order to receive this transportation, show proof of how they, went back and forth to the grocery store, how they got to work, proof of income. It was all of these things that they wanted this individual to show in order to qualify for transportation services through a grant that we have. And I was like, that right there to me is another barrier that we were creating for people who were already marginalized or disenfranchised because of poverty or their socioeconomic status to access our services. And the whole point of going after this additional funding was so we can eliminate a barrier and not place multiple barriers in place for that individual. So that's an example of a macro aggression that could take place. And then the microaggressions that can happen, there's micro insults, micro invalidations, and micro assaults. Micro insults are basically rude comments or that demean an individual's identity that they carry. And so we see that at the individual level, where going back to those negative stereotypes that are associated with an individual's racial identity can be a micro insult. A micro invalidation is where we negate a person's thoughts or feelings. One of our counselors was working with a young lady who was also, case was moving through the criminal justice system. And she said, hey, in counseling, talk to this young lady, say, hey, I don't think this detective believes me. I don't think this detective is really working on my behalf. And that counselor's response to her was, instead of saying, I'm sorry that that's what you're experiencing and validating her feelings, she invalidated her feelings by saying, hey, we work with that detective all the time. He's been pretty good on plenty of cases we worked for. He might have been, but for that Black survivor that was in that space right there in that moment, she felt that he wasn't believing her. She felt that he wasn't working on her best behalf. And so when we do that, we see a disconnect. When survivors get those micro invalidations, especially when it's connected to their cultural or racial identities, they can disengage in services at a high rate because of that. And then when you have micro assaults, this is just very blatant, outright discrimination that's very conscious, that's trying to cause harm to an individual. When I'm working on a sexual assault kit initiative project across the country, and in some of our police reports, you can see terms like this person is a hoe, she's a strawberry, which back in the 80s and 90s was a very derogatory term towards people who use drugs, who might have been forced to sell their bodies so they can get the drugs. You just saw all these things in these police reports. Those are flat out microaggressions that were considered micro assaults. And typically you saw that those cases were open and closed within 24 to 48 hours. And you cannot complete a sexual assault, sex trafficking investigation in 48 hours, unless your defendant admits to it right off the rip. But we saw this happening over and over again. And so when we commit these microaggressions, it really impacts the engagement for those survivors. And when you see that happening, you see a defendant is going to walk away from the court system and is going to cause more harm within the systems. I talked about the macroaggressions, and let's get into the impact before we get into some Q&A. So impact of microaggressions. There's a lot of research out here, folks, around the impact of microaggressions. When a person is feeling as though that they are being attacked because of their cultural identity, that's high level stress, that's traumatic. When you're constantly being attacked, or when people are constantly treating you differently because of your identities that you carry, that is high levels of stress. And what happens to our body? You all know the brain. When the brain is functioning without high levels of stress or trauma, it's functioning from the prefrontal cortex, the executive functioning of the brain that does the if, this, then, that thinking. When a person is experiencing high levels of stress or trauma, they have a amygdala hijack. And when that hijack is happening, the prefrontal cortex is weakened. And so they don't always have the ability to do that logical thinking in that moment. Because of the hormone tsunami that takes place in the body, the person is going to respond with a fight, flight, or freeze response. We know this when we're talking about survivors of sex trafficking and their trauma. But as professionals, we can initiate this hormone tsunami by the things that we say and how we're showing up with those survivors. I see it over and over again. Unfortunately, the survivors will freeze. They won't respond. They won't answer questions. They'll just sit there with this deer in the headlight look on their face. The fight response might not be a physical fight, but it could be like a verbal. And then they get told, then that's when you hear the survivor is very aggressive. They're a hostile witness on the stand. And that's that amygdala hijack is taking place. Or the flight can happen. The flight can happen. It's not that I've seen survivors leave a courtroom and run out of courtroom, run out of trial prep meetings, run out of meetings with the detectives. But typically we see that flight too is when they disengage. They're not returning your phone call. They're not coming in for that counseling session. They're not coming in for trial prep. The family is disconnecting because they don't feel that they're being heard when they're talking about some of the challenges and barriers that they have for engaging in the system. When a person experiences these microaggressions over and over again, there's consequences for them: anxiety, depression, that internalized oppression, hypertension, the loss of productivity, diminished cognitive thoughts. And so when you look at this list, this is sort of the same list that we see when we're talking about just traumatic experiences or responses to sexual violence or sex trafficking. And so as professionals, we can minimize this with how we show up and the things we say. So think about depowering your biases that you may carry. It's at the individual, again, level, the interpersonal and institutional level. Please do not start at the institutional level. I've worked with organizations where they said, hey, we've made all these policies and practices, but we're still having issues with survivors of color engaging with us, or survivors from the LGBT community engaging with us, or staff members, it's high turnover, we can't retain, we had a nice number of diverse people on staff because of the things we did at the institutional level. The mistake was they didn't start at the individual level. They didn't start working on self. They didn't start understanding their own cultural roots and how that impacts how they show up and engage interpersonally. So again, start at that individual level and then go to the interpersonal level. At the individual level, we need to shift from system 1 thinking to system 2 thinking. And this is where we control some of our unconscious biases. You know, at the system 1 thinking, it's very fast paced, it's automatic, it doesn't require any thinking. When we go to system 2 thinking, we are slower, we're more analytical, and we reflect more on our responses and in our actions. So real quick, I'm going to go over 4 steps that I believe helps in the depowering our biases. Improve the decision-making process. The way you do this is, instead of thinking about what assumptions are you making in a decision-making process, what facts do you have? When we're responding to sex trafficking and sexual violence, we should have a multidisciplinary team response. That helps us improve our decision-making process. We should have members from various different disciplines sitting at the table, discussing these cases, conducting case reviews, live case reviews, not just case reviews after the case is over, because when the case is over, we can do better for the next case. But if we do live case reviews, we can improve our decision-making process and any barriers that might be in place while that case is open and get a better outcome. And the other thing about the improving the decision-making process, don't go to your usual suspects. Don't go to people who think like you. Go to that person who may have a different opinion. Because our confirmation bias is typically, we look for resources or individuals that will confirm our biases. And so confirmation bias to me is a very lazy approach to making decisions. It doesn't require you to do any research or any thinking. And so go to the unusual suspects, create multidisciplinary teams, and make sure your multidisciplinary teams are diverse. Think about your communities you're in. Like, what high population, if you're in a highly populated Hispanic community, do you have individuals from the Hispanic community representation at the table? And then not to tokenize those people, because people are, you can have representation, they don't speak for the whole community, but they can help bring in different perspectives. And then countering those stereotypical imaging. And that's basically the negative stereotypes that are out here in our society. Counter them, replace them with more positive images. We were literally, my team was literally at a meeting with Child Protective Services and our human trafficking task force, because they were looking at the missing youth in the community. And these missing youth, a lot of them were young folks who they identified that are high risk of being trafficked or are currently being trafficked. And it was a picture of a young lady, and the picture was her school picture. And in that meeting, several professionals said she looks older. Oh, she looks like an adult. She doesn't look like she's 15 years old. And thankfully, somebody challenged them and said, where do you see it? It's a school picture. She looks like a child in here. She has her school uniform on. And the way and the manner in which they were talking about this young lady, until that other professional in the room stepped up and said something, her case wasn't getting the attention that it deserved. Another way to depower our biases is the individuating. This is really getting to learn people that one-on-one, sort of like I talked about that probation officer, how instead of reading his reports first, he waited to see about meeting with that youth and met with that youth first, instead of thinking about this youth as all of these negative things that might be on the paper in the file. But also when you individuate, you have to understand that that person has cultural identities that might have been marginalized in our society, understand how that impacts that person. And on a personal level, this is something I did when I talked about that individual work folks. And as a diversity, equity, inclusion professional, I had to change who I engaged with. Most of the people many years ago, they looked like me. They were all Black folks that I was engaging with outside of work. And so I have been intentionally putting myself in spaces that I can engage with people that look different from me, whether it's racial identity, ethnic identity, sexual orientation, religion, just different socioeconomic statuses, and really increasing my ability to go from a monocultural mindset to a global mindset. And with that, I'm able to engage in high levels of conflict across racial groups and across different cultural identities. And that's one way we can definitely depower our biases. Cultural humility, I talked about that a little bit earlier, really understanding how our own cultural backgrounds, experiences influence our biases and the physiological, psychological process, and really get into a place where we can have respect for differences. It's okay if we are different. It's okay if that survivor that you're engaging with is using language that you would say, I would never talk like that. And instead of judging them and holding it against them, be okay and say, oh, whatever that person is going through, this is how they need to express their trauma. This is how they need to express whatever is going on in their life. And so that's where we are humbling ourselves and allowing people to show up how they need to show up in a moment. Some macro recommendations for law enforcement. Again, build diverse task forces. We know that the vast majority of law enforcement in some communities might not have a lot of racial diversity on them, but try to find it. Try to really build those diverse task forces. And a lot of our task forces are male dominated. I know our human trafficking task force is all men right now. I'm pushing. Hopefully we can get a female added to that task force, like a female. That'd be great. It'd be great if we had multiple females on the task force, but just looking at diversity across the spectrum, not just racial diversity, but diversity and tenure in the field as well. Work with your community-based advocates. You really having those community-based advocates at the table and working with your task force teams responding to sex trafficking is very helpful. They have a lot of resources, and then train. Training is so crucial, but we have to get from a place where we're just going to trainings and not actually going and taking that stuff from theory to application. Work to build bridges with communities of color. Work collectively with your community-based advocates and doing projects and going into community presentations together, doing community awareness around trafficking. One of the things I noticed is that a lot of times when we're in a communities training with regards to human trafficking, people say they're scared to come forward because they believe that these young ladies are going to be seen as criminals. And so they don't want to give disclose that they're victimized, or they don't want to give tips and help out law enforcement. So we have to really change that concept, that dynamic, where people see the system as a partner and not somebody that's going to hold them accountable for some criminal activities that they were forced to do. Courts and really establishing that empowerment model I kind of talked about earlier, that empowerment model where we give voice and choice, incorporating those 6 key principles of trauma-informed care, examining the data regarding access to specialized docket, looking at, your community, who's being trafficked, who's being charged with prostitution, are they having access to these specialized dockets? I think it's really important to examine the data at all times. Again, that community-based victim advocates are so important. Sometimes people say, if we have a system-based advocate, there's no need for a community-based advocate. And I would tell you, survivors have the best when they have both a community-based advocate and a system-based advocate working on their behalf. Community-based advocates have access to a variety of resources, where system-based advocates sometimes have direct access to understanding what's going on, and they have access to the prosecutor's office. Of course, incorporating that restorative justice model is really important for survivors of sex trafficking who also have criminal records, so they can walk away and into more of a model of restorative practices and a model that helps them instead of causing them harm and penalizing them, and also helps them understand their behaviors. Again, training is crucial. Some macro recommendations for advocacy organizations is sort of the same thing. Operate from a model of empowerment versus a maternalistic. One of the things I see with some of our advocacy organizations in our nonprofit sectors is this savior mentality. We need to really step away from that savior mentality and working with folks and really understanding that survivors are they have the most knowledge about their experience and what they need to help them through their healing process. And then examine the use of evidence-based programming. So often our evidence-based programming is really, really designed for the dominant culture. So with that, we really have to look and examine the use of evidence-based programming. I know a lot of our grantors, they want us to use evidence-based programming, but if evidence-based programming is constantly designed for the dominant group and it doesn't bring into that historical trauma aspect, then we're really not using the best programming for survivors. We're approaching it in a cookie cutter approach. Excuse me. And just some other macro recommendations that I say is, I said it before, active case reviews, do a cultural needs assessment, really look at how your organization, your community is responding to survivors of color, and seeing if we are responding in the most trauma-informed and in culturally inclusive manner. Multicultural representation is really needed on the MDT. Advocate for criminal justice reform. Replace that zero tolerance in schools with more restorative justice practices, especially when we know that students of color are pushed out of schools at a higher rate and into the criminal justice system. And that sets them up for the more likelihood of being trafficked and access, not only trafficked, but also for other criminal behaviors to take place. And establish equity primes in your decision-making process. And so equity primes are basically something that can help with the decision-making process. This is when you are at a choice point and you need to make a decision. And think about some of the equity primes. What decision or your action will reinforce the status quo? What biases are in place right now? How might this decision impact the most marginalized in our society? So at the Cleveland Ray Crisis Center, we established equity primes and actually have them as desk cards where everyone has them at their desk, and they're able to use these in meetings and when they're going in supervision and when they're engaging with folks. And so these equity primes have really been helpful for us as an organization because they are a reminder about our own privileges that we carry, and as a reminder that for us to continuously look at through every decision that we make through equity. And so I am going to stop sharing, and I see we have time for a few questions. I know I went through that pretty fast.
We sure do. There is a question in the chat that relates to your personal life experience. Are you willing to discuss that, or I just want to respect your privacy? I don't think it's easy, but you described difficult times in your youth that were semi-related to that of the difficult times that that young woman who you encountered who had spent most of her life in the system. What do you think made the difference in your adult life rather than that of that young woman?
That's a good question. You know, I think for me, what happened for me in my healing process, I had a daughter at a very young age, and that just changed a lot for me, that it was no longer about me, that I was living for somebody else. And because of that, I dug deep. But even when I dug deep and was seeking out counseling and trying to get help, I mean, it was lifelong work. Still, I can remember working in the Anthony Soul case, which is a case where the guy in Cleveland had murdered over 10 women and buried them and sexually assaulted a whole lot of women. And during that time period, I have been dealing with my own victimization privately and only a few friends. And it became very public in my family during the midst of that trial. I was triggered in the middle of doing this work. And so it's lifelong work. And I just had to really develop the tools. I stayed in counseling, but I would tell you in counseling, no one ever told me to go to the Cleveland Ray Crisis Center. It wasn't a community place that the counselors that I felt that I was engaging with felt that it was an organization that would help somebody that looked like me. And that was because majority of the staff, or all of the staff, were predominantly white women. They weren't in the community doing awareness and education. It was just pure determination and prayer.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Of a mom of a daughter myself, I completely understand how they transform you, and you aren't living for yourself anymore. So I completely get that. There's a lot of thank yous in the chat about how impactful and amazing your presentation was, and I couldn't echo that any louder. I think it was a really great way to really tie in what we've been talking about all week. We learned about gangs yesterday, so we touched on that. We've talked about disproportionality and minority representation in our statewide programs. They wish you were here in person so they could shake your hand, and you should be very proud of all the work you're doing. I agree. We are trying to launch a program for at-risk youth and would like to know if Teresa does guest speaking at events as well. They feel you're inspirational. So if that's something you're interested, Teresa, I will make that connection for you. Something that you said that I felt was so powerful was very early on, you talked about being culturally humble. And I think that that is so key. And it's something we talked about this yesterday when we were talking about the disproportionality, is that we are so, I don't want to use we collectively, but I find that sometimes people are so afraid to be seen as either ignorant or racist or have stereotypes or have bias, that it actually comes off in a more negative connotation.
Absolutely.
So, something we've talked about all week is you don't know what you don't know, but when you know better, you do better. So it's always better. And I have learned this in my professional career, to ask when you don't know. So, because once you know, knowledge is power, right?
It also can show up as like racial anxiety, on both sides of the spectrum. So when you think about racial anxiety, white folks don't want to be seen as a racist, right? Exactly. And they don't want to put their foot in the mouth. So that may cause, if they don't engage or cross racial culturally at a high rate, that may cause some anxiety and when people have high levels of anxiety, the biases can come out unconsciously at a higher rate. And then for people of color, they don't want to be seen as someone associated with those stereotypes that are associated with their identities. And then they also don't want to, be discriminated against at the same time. So you have this dynamic where you have both parties have high levels of anxiety going on at the same time, and it's a great disaster for a mishap to happen. And so that's why I say I do believe this is the individual work. This is not just 9 to 5 stuff. This is like how you're living your life and how you're showing up. Yeah. You have to engage across different cultural groups at a higher rate to get to a level of comfortability for everyone.
I couldn't agree more. You're getting, again, just more thank yous and how amazing your presentation was. And something else that I think you emphasized, I think that I always bring back to the work, is that something that is pivotal to the work we do when we're working with young people and generally, is that a key element of our work is self-reflection and really looking at why are we acting the way we're acting? Why are we choosing the choices we're making? Why are we using terminology we're using, whatever? And how is that impacting this person's response to me? And how can I change that if I'm looking for a different response? Rather than this young person is just, as you gave in a perfect example, they're being difficult. They don't want help. They are angry. Well, why? Why? Is there a change I can make in my interactions with this young person that could possibly, because we don't know, change the response I'm getting so I can do my job and do it well? Because I think, every person who's on this call is here because they want to be, right?
Absolutely.
That's so key. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. If you think of questions, I want to be very respectful of Teresa's time. You can email me and I will put you in contact with Teresa. As we wrap up for the week, I do want to do some really quick thank yous. Thank you to Commissioner Sheila Poole and Deputy Commissioner Nina Alladort for all of their support, my director, Madeline Hare, and our amazing staff for all of their support and encouragement. The awesome team at the Welfare Research Institute, Jen, Lisa, Jason, Jean, and Darlene, I don't want to forget anybody, for their help in all aspects of coordinating this event. All of our presenters, Teresa included, for sharing their experience, their time, and their knowledge with us. And most importantly, all of you who have participated in Summit. Every day, I am appreciative, impressed, and inspired by your passion and dedication to improving the lives of young people and the communities you serve. Thank you for being here all week. That's a wrap on Summit 21. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you so much.